This video is sponsored by Wondrium. More on that in a bit. West of Eden is a science fiction novel that takes place in an alternative universe where dinosaurs never went extinct 66 million years ago. As a result, the present day depicts a human-like tribe known as the Tanu who are at odds with an unusual force known as the Yilane, a race of humanoid reptilians that are descended from prehistoric animals but are now the most advanced species on the planet, even more advanced than the Tanu. The two groups have a deep hatred for each other, but the Tanu are at a disadvantage. Not only are they outnumbered by the Yilane, but the Yilane also have biological forces beyond our wildest imaginations that are used to exterminate any and all Tanu they come in contact with. So in order to avoid the extinction of their race, the Tanu must adapt to the new world, even if it means resorting to unconventional methods that go against their culture and lifestyle. The book was written in 1984 by Harry Harrison, who's best known for his more humorous works like Stainless Steel Rat and Bill the Galactic Hero series. But his dive into more serious and experimental works would lead him to use a more long-form method of creating books, ones where he would spend an immense amount of time researching about in order to make it as realistic as possible. West of Eden is one of those books. Seriously, I can't emphasize enough just how much there is in this book. On surface level, it may just seem like it's about a conflict between humans and humanoid reptilians, and it is, but there's so much more to it than just that. The book is about learning to adapt in a new world and learning to let go of old ways of life and incorporate new methods in order to survive. It has themes of misplacement and wanting to find a sense of belonging in the world. It explores the complex culture, history, language, biology, and overall worldview of the Yilane, and it constantly expands the world of the Tanu as you progress in the story, introducing new elements of life in this already mysterious setting. This is a pretty great book, and I recommend you guys to seek it out for yourselves before continuing this video because there will be a bunch of spoilers, and it's one of those stories that's best experienced by just reading it yourself. Plus, there's just so much to the story of West of Eden and its upbringing that I decided to approach this video differently. West of Eden actually ended up spawning two more sequels, Winter in Eden and Return to Eden. And when I first found out about the whole trilogy, I immediately thought that I would make my video on it in the same style as my Quintaglio Ascension trilogy video. But again, it became very clear that there was just so much information about this trilogy that it would be best to tackle it one book at a time. So consider this the first episode of the West of Eden trilogy retrospective because today I want to explore the author, backstory, and overall world of West of Eden. But before we do that, a quick word from our sponsor. I'm really excited to tell you guys about Wondrium, a premier entertaining and educational video subscription service that offers an array of programs, courses, and documentaries of various different fields. While most of you seem to enjoy the weird, fictional, and exaggerated pop culture paleomedia that I like covering here on the channel, it's not for everyone. A lot of people want to learn more about real-world events and history and sciences, and yes, that includes dinosaurs. As you all should know by now, I love dinosaurs, and luckily for me, Wondrium has a few different programs that are all about them. One of their most recent ones being Rediscovering the Age of Dinosaurs, a great walkthrough and introduction into the world of dinosaurs that I definitely recommend to any newcomers interested in the field. It was fun learning and revisiting some of the different concepts I've seen and heard about and even covered here on my channel before. For example, the story behind the the infamous scrotum humanum fossil, which was a megalosaurus femur bone that was initially thought to have belonged to giants of biblical stories, and was given this scientific name due to its weird yet familiar shape. Okay, that was a weird example, I'll admit. And if you're someone who's trying to find a new learning outlet or content that provides the answers to anything you've ever wondered about, then look no further than Wondrium. They have an extensive and carefully curated collection of content that ranges from science and history, to religion and culture, to literature and music, to technology and mathematics, and everything in between. All of which are well researched and presented by engaging and knowledgeable experts. Along with the range of content, there's also a range of formats as well, like tutorials, lectures, documentaries, how-tos, and travelogues, so you have a lot to choose from. So what are you waiting for? If you've ever wondered about anything and or are seeking to find new educational and entertaining experiences, then Wondrium is the place for you. And it's a good time to check it out because right now they're offering viewers a free trial. If you want to take advantage of that and you want to help support the channel, you can do so by visiting wondrium.com/dinodiego and subscribing to Wondrium today. You can find and click on this link at the top of the description below to start your free trial. Seriously, your brain is going to love this place. Huge thanks to Wondrium for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to it. So to know a bit about the book, we should talk about Harry Harrison for a bit. Like I said earlier, Harrison is a science fiction author who was a prominent figure in that genre of literature. And his interest of science fiction can be dated all the way back to when he was a kid. Harrison was an only child born in 1925 in Stamford, Connecticut. His childhood consisted of him moving around a lot as he was born right before the Great Depression, causing his parents to chase after jobs, and in turn causing Harrison to not stay in one spot long enough to make any real friends. Eventually, Harrison's family would find a spot in a borough of New York City known as Queens. Despite his loneliness, Harrison managed to find comfort and adventure through pulp fiction and sci-fi magazines. He would read things from Amazing Stories to Operator 5 to The Spider and so on. This fascination with science fiction made Harrison interested in art more than writing, so he would start out by making his own comics at an early age. And to give you an idea of just how much Harrison loved science fiction, at the age of 13 he would become one of the founders of the Queens chapter for the Science Fiction League. Okay, that most likely means absolutely nothing to you guys, but basically the Science Fiction League was one of, if not the earliest example of a fandom or fan organization, and it was actually created by Hugo Gernsback, who was the creator of the Amazing Stories and later the Wonder Stories magazines that I've mentioned here on the channel before. The Science Fiction League was looking to become a more generalized group, so they wanted to enlist more members from all around. They did this by starting a trend called chapters, which were groups of people that were selected by the league to be members of the fandom. There were a couple of rules to this. For example, it was a one group per city thing, which the chapters would be named after, and there had to be a certain amount of members in that chapter for it to be official. So in Harrison's case, he lived in Queens at the time, so he was a part of the Queens chapter for the Science Fiction League. When Harrison would turn 18 and graduate high school, he decided to enlist in the military. However, he was very selective of his choices. You see, Harrison fancied the idea of, not dying, so he opted for the Air Force to work as ground crew, as funny as that sounds. He was drafted into the US Army Air Corps, and he didn't like his time there. But he was given several responsibilities, including working on analog computers, being a truck driver, an armorer, and even a machine gun instructor. It was during his time in the army where he would also learn Esperanto, which is an artificial and international auxiliary language that I guess was made for people to learn other languages easier. I'm only mentioning this because it was one of the most consistent things I found while researching Harrison, so it makes me think it'll have some relevance later, maybe, I don't really know. Anyways, Harrison was discharged from the army in February of 1946, and when he returned to civilian life, he had no clue what he wanted to do. Revisiting his passion of making comics, he decided to take some art courses at Hunter College, New York City, and Cartoonist and Illustrator School, where he would meet several people who would later become well known in the comic book world. One of these people was Wallace Wood, who Harrison would partner and create comic books with for a few years in a small studio that they had, where they worked as freelance artists for magazines and advertisements. Harrison's work would get noticed by a prestigious science fiction organization known as the Hydra Club, who were made up of professional science fiction authors like Isaac Asimov and L. Sprague de Camp. The organization would grant him an official membership where he would meet some of these people, including Damon Knight, who was another science fiction writer. Harrison's career as a writer wasn't one that he just decided to go for out of nowhere. His initial passion was making comics and drawing, but his transition from a comic book artist to an author would slowly begin. One day when Harrison was sick with the flu and couldn't draw, he decided to write instead, and wrote his first short story initially titled I Walk Through Rocks. He didn't really know what to do with the short story, so he showed it to Damon Knight. Knight seemed to have liked it because he would buy the story off of Harrison, make a few edits, and would publish it in an issue of Worlds Beyond, which was yet another sci-fi magazine that Knight was an editor for. Knight of course credited Harrison and released a short story under a different title, Rock Diver. While it didn't seem like it now, since Harrison's eventual transition to being an author was a gradual one, this would prove to be a significant event for him because it showed him that he could write science fiction as well as drawing it. Of course, he didn't always see it that way since Harrison was very self-critical of his writing early on, but he would branch out and do more than just create art for comics. He would also edit comics and magazines and wrote scripts as well. And this branching out would actually be beneficial for him because the comic book age was slowing down, and he would take up writing science fiction for different magazines. However, he wasn't entirely satisfied with this. Around 1956, Harrison would quit his job as a freelance writer and artist to finally work on his first novel. It was also around this time that he grew tired of New York. At this point in his life, he had already stopped working with Wallace Wood for a while and actually had a wife and child. And for a little while, they would move around. They lived in Mexico for a bit, then they moved back to New York and eventually made their way to Italy, where he would find work from a friend of a friend who would turn out to be Dan Barry, the creator of a comic book character named Flash Gordon. Harrison would work with him for several years while doing his own independent projects, including some of his most well-known works like Stainless Steel Rat, and eventually his first novel, Death World, in 1960. He would send his finished novel to another science fiction author that he knew, John W. Campbell, who I at least know him from his novella Who Goes There, because it would be made into a film adaptation of one of my most favorite horror movies ever, The Thing. However, Campbell was a massive contributor in shaping science fiction during this period of time. At this point, Campbell was an editor for Astounding Science Fiction and helped Harrison get his book published with them in their January 1960 issue. Campbell always seemed to have had a knack for helping others working in the genre of science fiction literature flesh out their ideas, and he did the same for Harrison and his books. It would be at this point Harrison entered the Campbell era of his writing career, as some might call it, where a lot of his stories had that Campbell style, probably because he was taking a lot of advice and pointers from the man himself. But it would only be a matter of time before Harrison would want to do his own thing entirely without the help of anyone from the science fiction world. This was a tough thing for Harrison to do since he was still getting over the obstacle of the self-criticism he still held for his earlier works. At one point, he even called himself the most unliterary of writers. But in 1965, Harrison would get his first experimental book finished and published by a different science fiction magazine known as New Worlds. This would kickstart a new phase in Harrison's career as a sci-fi author, as he went into it with the mentality that he wanted to improve the reputation and general quality of the genre. As a result, his books became more research-intensive and would tackle mature topics like his well-known 1966 novel, Make Room, Make Room, which would explore the consequences of pollution and overpopulation, of which he spent 5 years of research for to make it as realistic of a world as possible. This kind of historical and scientific research would become more common in his later works, and they would also become less humorous and more grim. West of Eden was one of those stories, and after reading it myself, I can definitely confirm there were disturbing moments in the book where I had to take a break from actually reading it for a bit, and there were other moments where the tension was very high from the fact that the main characters never felt safe from the Yilane no matter where they went. I don't know, maybe I'm sensitive, or maybe Harrison is just a good author. Regardless, I can confirm that there's really not much humor in this story, if any at all. But as someone who didn't really know too much about Harrison until actually reading this book, I can only imagine the surprise of his more avid fans who were used to his more humorous and satirical works after they read this book. But we'll get to why it's surprising later. For now, I still want to talk about the making of it because Harrison really did put a lot of effort in this book. He was actually inspired to make it after seeing the infamous Dale A. Russell Dinosauroid design on TV. Naturally, he became interested in the idea of futuristic dinosaurs and the possibility of them possessing human levels of intelligence. Mainly, he saw the potential it had for the world of science fiction, and at the time, not many people were exploring that area, probably because the idea itself was still new to them. So Harrison took advantage of the moment and started his 2-year research on dinosaurs and building a complex society for them. And he really wanted this story to be as realistic as possible. So he enlisted several experts of different fields that he knew of and contacted so that he could get their input and help on building what would eventually become West of Eden. Harrison would get anthropologist Leon Stover to help him figure out his dilemma for the Tanu's evolutionary history in the story, because if he was to make this story about an alternative timeline where dinosaurs never went extinct, that means old world primates would never get the chance to emerge, which would technically make the human evolutionary history that we know today non-existent. So they had to evolve from new world primates, which would contribute to the explanation as to why the Tanu are still as primitive as they are in the book. Jack Cohen, a professor of biology at Warwick University, would also be enlisted to help out with the biology of the Yilane themselves, while John R. Pierce, who was an engineer and physicist, was there to help develop the biological world of the Yilane. Then there was the linguistics expert Professor T.A. Shippey, who was brought on to aid Harrison in the creation of the Yilane's complex language system and the Marbok language familiar to the Tanu. Finally, Harrison called up Robert Myers, a philosopher who was brought in to help Harrison develop the belief system around the Daughters of Life that featured in the book. All of this information may sound like complete nonsense to you guys now for those that might be new to the story, but we'll get into all of it here in a bit. Then of course we had the artwork for the cover and interior of the book, which were done by Gino Dakile and Bill Sanderson respectively. Most of the art that you'll see in this video will be from them. So yeah, this just goes to show that Harrison really went above and beyond with this book, having experts at the ready to aid him in whatever information he needed to make this world and its inhabitants all the more believable and realistic. In fact, 2 years and 30,000 words worth of notes later, and Harrison still hadn't even started on the plot for the story. He just really wanted it to be great, so he spent the time to make sure it was. So the question now is, what would result from all of this research? Let's see it. As I already mentioned, West of Eden takes place in a different timeline where the KT extinction didn't happen. There was no meteor and there was no mass extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are still the dominant species in this world, and it's because of that the Tanu tribe, which are one of the more advanced mammalian species in the story, reside in the northern regions of a landmass known as Gendasi, where climates are too cold for the saurian species to survive in. While this landmass is called Gendasi in the book, we know it as North America in our real world. The northern regions may have colder climates, but they also have other mammalian life like deer, mammoths, smilodons, and so on. Due to the difference in evolutionary history in the book, certain animals like bears and canines never evolved in this timeline and do not exist. But it's because of this particular region, essentially a corner in the world where mammals were isolated long enough to establish their own advanced evolutionary history, certain animals were able to thrive away from the dangers of the dinosaurs that roamed the southern regions of the continent. And over a span of several millions of years, the human-like Tanu would emerge and inevitably encounter some of these dinosaurs down south. While the dinosaurs and other reptile-like animals have varying names in this universe due to the Tanu and the Yilane having different names for them, prehistoric fauna that continued to survive included animals like Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, Segnosaurus, Psittacosaurus, Coelurosaurus, Elasmosaurus, and so on. But little did the Tanu know a greater conflict was yet to come, because across the body of water east from Gendasi that's known as the Atlantic Ocean in our world, would be another continent known as Entobon, or as we know it, Africa. In this continent, a race of intelligent humanoid saurians called the Yilane would emerge earlier than the Tanu, for their ancestors lived during the time of the dinosaurs. And the Yilane are very intelligent creatures, mastering levels of sciences that are far beyond the comprehension of the Tanu, and would also be used against them. For the longest time, the land they lived in was warm enough of a climate for them to survive in. But a combination of population overgrowth and climate change would soon reach to a point where expansion and migration was necessary. So the Yilane would travel west, where they would establish and grow their new city known as Alpeasoc. The funniest part about this whole thing is that the region they decided to settle in is actually Florida in our world, which actually feels quite fitting. So many weird things happen in Florida anyway, a city of humanoid lizards doesn't seem all that out of the ordinary. ordinary. While the new land seems to be fit for the Yilane, they'll soon come to realize that they aren't alone, as an invasive species of animal, which would be the Tanu, gets in the way of their plans. And the first conflicts between the two groups would forever seal the deep hatred they would grow to have for each other. From this point on, only one species could live. The Tanu are a nomadic group of primitive hunters that live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They follow where the hunt is, and since their food is always on the move, so are they. In their earlier days, things like deer and rabbits were plentiful for the most part in the northern regions of Gendasi, and they're animals that the Tanu know are safe to eat. And like I said earlier, the explanation for their primitive status, despite this story taking place in the modern day, is due to there never being old world primates for the humans to evolve from in this timeline. Instead, the Tanu have evolved from new world primates and so are far behind in human advancements than where we're currently at. The Tanu wear hides made from animal skins, they live in tents and use fire as a source of light, and to cook their meat with, they hunt with spears and bows and arrows. They use mastodons to help them pull travoy of resources and supplies for when they're on the move, and so on. As far as their lifestyle goes, it's a rather simple one. The males hunt and bring the food, while the females stay behind and gather plant materials, cook the meat brought by the hunters, and care for the children. The Tanu move in smaller bands made up of a few families, which they call samads. There are several samads that take up different areas of the north, but they aren't completely estranged from each other. In fact, some samads meet and congregate at certain points, and families aren't forced or obligated to stay in one specific samad and are free to depart and join a new one, given they are welcomed by them. And since the Tanu's lifestyle is based on going where the hunt goes, the samad's leader is typically based on the best hunter of the group, since they're the ones that will be able to track the hunts the best. These leaders are called the Samadars. Then there's the Tanu's language, which is known as Marbok. The language isn't something that's extensively explored in the book, but I figured I'd still mention it because there is some Marbok vocabulary that's used, and I'll be referring to some of that vocabulary throughout the video. Marog is used by the Tanu when they're referring to pretty much any kind of dinosaur or dinosaur-related animal, including the Yilane. Murgu is plural of Marog and is used when they're referring to multiple of the saurian animals. We already went through Samad and Samadar, but there's also the vocab they use for their religion as well, which is pretty straightforward and nothing too deep as of yet. The Tanu have a god or deity that they believe in that goes by the informal name of Skyfather, which is translated from the more formal Marbok name Erman Padar. And finally, the Tanu refer to their spirits as Tharms. That's just a few examples of them that I thought I'd mention now to avoid confusion later, but it's possible that I missed some, so I'll just cover those as we get to them. But I think that's pretty much it for the Tanu, so let's go ahead and move on to the next segment. And now we're finally at the part that you guys really clicked on this video for, the Yilane race. The Yilane are a race of extremely intelligent and complex humanoid saurians that are derived from tylosaurs, a marine reptile that was a genus of mosasaur and lived during the late Cretaceous period. Because they avoided the mass extinction that would take out the dinosaurs in the true real-world timeline, they managed to succeed in intelligence far beyond any other living thing on Earth in the 66 million years they've had to evolve. During that time, the Yilane would physically develop to live closer to land, and eventually fully develop to live a terrestrial lifestyle, resulting in some of their modern characteristics. They now have 2 legs and are bipedal, but despite this, they're not the best runners. However, they've managed to keep their swimming abilities. They have 2 fingers on one side of their hands and 2 thumbs on the other side, giving them optimal dexterity. They still have their tail, but as we'll discuss here in a bit, they mainly use it for gesturing within their language system. And along with everything else, they're warm-blooded and exothermic animals. During their evolution, they would also develop their complex system of language, which not only consists of verbal sounds, but also gestures of their tail and limbs, and the color changes of their palms. The Yilane language is a vital factor in their society, as it determines an individual's rank and intelligence. So, this whole video so far, I've been referring to this intelligent saurian race as Yilane, but technically they have a few labels for themselves that's dependent on their societal status among their community, which itself is determined by how well they can master their complex language and contribute to their society using it as they grow up. So technically, when a Yilane is born, they aren't given the label as Yilane due to them being young and of low intelligence. If they learn the language well enough, they will be considered educated, of higher rank and intelligence, and given more responsibilities and important jobs that involve running and managing certain aspects of the city and society. At this point, they would have earned the title of Yilane. Those that don't manage to understand the language system stay under the title of Fargi and are considered to be uneducated, lower in rank and intelligence, but are still given simple but important jobs of manual labor in construction and agriculture, along with serving as troops aiding the more skilled huntresses, who would actually be considered Yilane, in battle if necessary. And from my understanding of the Fargi that are of the lowest rank and cannot speak at all, meaning the dumbest of the bunch, they are considered to be Yilibe, I think is how you pronounce it. Actually, now that I think of it, this word might just be given to anything that doesn't speak, period, which based on how the book uses it, it seems like it's meant to be more of an insulting term. And if I have it correct, to the Yilane, pretty much any creature that's not them falls under this category, because they believe nothing else in the world can truly speak to each other in any comprehensive language. To the Yilane, when the Tanu speak to each other, they don't hear words, they just hear mumbles and grunts, because these humans' verbal-only language is not as advanced as their verbal gesture combination set. And just so we're not confused, I'm gonna continue referring to them as Yilane for the rest of this video, at least for the most part. Anyways, this system of communication is implied to have started in their early years out in the ocean, and I assume would continue to develop as they eventually transition to their modern-day terrestrial lifestyle. While the origins of their language is up in the air, the Yilane have come up with two possible theories for what could have started it. There's the swim-swim theory and the ping-ping theory. The swim-swim theory posits that the attempts of communication originated from the Yilane mimicking movements from other sea life to signal and gesture to one another. This would explain their use of gestures when they communicate in the present day. The ping-ping theory indicates that the first attempts of communication originated with sound, by mimicking the sounds of fish or other marine animals to communicate with one another, and the gestures would follow sometime later. But according to the Yilane account of their own history, a lot of their early days were poorly documented, so it's hard to tell which of these theories are correct. Among the poorly documented but significant events in the Yilane's evolutionary history was their transition from water to land. Of what was documented, it told of Yilane eventually using the shores as the designated spots for males to carry the eggs and care for the young until they hatch and are ready to venture out in the open seas. You'll pick up more about the life cycle of the Yilane as we continue, but what's important to know now is that the early years of the Yilane meant sticking with more primitive methods of defense against predators that would stumble upon their birth beaches. The Yilane would use live animals like crustacea and corals for means of protection, which would likely be a precursor of what was to come for the future of Yilane tools and weaponry. As the Yilane became more advanced and aware of the world around them, they would eventually learn about the natural science of their environment and wildlife, and they would begin to find more elaborate ways to use this to their advantage. Eventually, the Yilane would become intelligent enough to learn how to genetically modify and bioengineer live animals and breed them to be literal weapons and tools. It is extremely weird and disturbing, but very fascinating. For example, they have a live weapon called a Hazotsan, which are reptilian animals, I believe monitor lizards to be more specific, and they're modified and bred to be a specific shape and structure to function like a dart gun. The Hazotsans are shaped like a long stick that have an opening on the side of it. That opening is where it's fed through, but is also where you load the darts in as well. You have to hold and press on the animal in a certain way for the darts to shoot out, and when it does, a steam-like reaction will occur, which will send out a loud cracking sound as the dart passes through the long-barreled snout of the Heizotsan. What ultimately makes this the deadliest weapon in the book is that as the dart shoots out of the Heizotsan, it will pass through a gland within the animal that contains a very deadly toxin. So deadly that even an animal as large as a mastodon will go down within minutes after being struck by the dart. The only disadvantage of the Heizotsan is that the range is not that good, but if it's fed well and you keep the darts, it can last years. But this is just one example of the tools they have. In fact, almost all, if not everything in their city is alive. The cities are made up of modified trees that will grow into large structures that essentially serve as buildings and indoor areas for the Yilane. Their quote-unquote boats that they use to travel overseas are domesticated ichthyosaurs that are modified to be enlarged and hollowed so that they're able to reside inside of the animal for long-distance voyages. These live boats also have openings and barriers at the top, giving the Yilane an outside area for them to walk around and view their surroundings on. They also have a terrestrial mode of transportation as well in the form of a modified Psittacosaurus. Now, for those of you that know your dinosaurs, I know what you might be thinking. Diego, how the hell are the Yilane going to use this small and cute little animal as a form of transportation? Well, in one of their more extreme examples of genetically modified animals, the Psittacosaurs in this book are modified to be very large and 8-legged, designed to carry large loads of supplies and Yilane troops, which we'll see more of later in the story. But that's not all. I'm realizing that as I'm recording this, it sounds like I'm trying to sell you guys a bunch of Yilane-made products. But that's not all. Look at this other bioengineered live animal that's made into a tool that you can buy in this as seen on TV commercial. My god, how disturbing would that be? Okay, but really there are other things that the Yilane have created as well. As far as clothing, the only kind of apparel the Yilane seem to wear are cloaks during the colder seasons, and guess what? Even the damn cloaks are live animals created by the Yilane that, if fed and taken care of, will produce body heat of up to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. So yeah, this goes to show just how advanced and alien the Yilane race is, and don't worry, if you find this stuff fascinating, there are several more examples that we'll get into as we go through the story. But for now, I think you guys get the idea. One of the reasons why the Yilane are made to essentially be saurian mad scientists and create artificial freaks of nature for their own convenience is because Harrison wanted to make their race as alien as possible. And to do that, he wanted their lifestyle and practices to come off as unconventional and even disturbing from the human perspective, but not so much to the point where it feels like they don't belong here on Earth. So with that in mind, the Yilane would have some strange and different behavioral, societal, and physiological aspects to their lifestyle. To give you some examples, starting with their physiology, the development of modern Yilane biology has some unique disadvantages. The Yilane are physiologically advanced enough, or maybe not advanced enough depending on how you look at it, to the point where their metabolism is dependent on their culture. You first have to understand the Yilane have a strict way of life, and the main goal of all individuals should be to strive to be a contributor to their society. Those who break laws or go against certain orders, traditions, customs, ideas, etc., run the risk of being exiled, shunned, shamed, or punished in some way by the higher-ups of their community, which is seen as a big deal to them. This kind of social pressure and drastic negative change can potentially cause the Yilane to literally seize up and die. As weird as it sounds, Harrison explains in the book that the Yilane have an internal hormonal mechanism within a section of their brain called the hypothalamus that typically controls certain functions like sexual behaviors and metabolism, which used to exist within their ancestors for hibernation purposes. Now this mechanism serves as a disadvantage to the Yilane because should they be faced with a situation in which they are forced to deal with their offenses or any kind of negative change, this section of their brain brain will become overloaded with the pressure of physiological change to the Yilane's way of life and ideas, which will then in turn cause the Yilane to seize up and die. Despite some of their disadvantages, the Yilane are well aware that they are the dominant animals on the planet, which gives them a rather arrogant outlook on the world, considering all other living things as inferior and stupid and only holding importance if they're of any use to them. They especially hold this idea towards the Estuzu, which is what they refer to as the humans and primates and pretty much all mammalian animals in their language. The Yilane view the Estuzu, or the Tanu, as a disgusting and feral invasive species of animals that need to be eradicated, kind of in the same way we as humans would view rats or bugs. Despite this arrogance, or maybe to them just confidence, there is one thing that they haven't managed to figure out yet, and that's the concept of lying. And that's mainly because their language structure and formal social behaviors have limited some of their abilities to develop that sort of concept. For them, keeping personal thoughts and secrets are hard, as naturally the ideas can be read and viewed easily from how the Yilane speak and gesture alone. So the best way for a Yilane to keep their thoughts and ideas from others is to simply not talk at all. This will change, as you'll see when we get to the story. From a societal angle, the Yilane are a matriarchal society, meaning it's ran primarily by or only by females. The males in the Yilane society are viewed as stupid, dull creatures that live what females would consider to be a more leisure and carefree lifestyle, since the male typically ends up becoming artists, poets, singers, and so on. They're typically placed in a residential area made specifically for them called a hanale, and only stay here until they're needed by the females for reproduction. The female Yilanes take over more important and work-intensive roles to be city leaders, military leaders, scientists, and so on. And most of them are pretty ruthless, as you'll see in the story. And speaking of the story, I think this is a good place to end this segment. There's probably more I can talk about with the Yilane, but whatever I don't cover here, I'll be sure to talk about in my other videos on this series, as the Yilane story will only progress after this one. But for now, let's get into the West of Eden. The story begins with a small group of Tanu deep in the southern edges of Gendasi, well within Murgu territories. They've spent some of the summer stalking and hunting the herds of deer that have become less abundant in the north as they've changed their courses to venture more south, forcing the Tanu hunters to leave the sanctity of their home to give chase so that they have enough food to last them until spring. Leading this small group is Amahast, the Samadar of the few families that these hunters are a part of. With him is his 8-year-old son Carrick, who is on his first hunt with the men. They traveled here by water, and their efforts and travels would prove successful as they've managed to locate and hunt enough deer to fill up their boats. Due to an oncoming storm though, their trip back home will have to wait until the following day. In the meantime, they plan to preserve the deer meat by smoking it, so while the other hunters gather the carcasses, Amahast and Carrick go down to the beaches to find driftwood. On their way, they would make a horrifying discovery. They would run into a lone Marog, but not just any Marog. This one was different as it stood and walked on its 2 feet with a straight back like a man. The Tanu have grown a disdain for all Murgu regardless of how they looked or stood, as they see them as dangerous and foul creatures. And that's why Amahast would immediately go after the Marog and kill it with his spear. But they soon realized that this one wasn't alone. As they continue down the beach, they find 3 more of these Murgu by the water's edge. 2 were very similar to the one that Amahast just killed, but the third one was fatter and laid on its back by the water. And in an almost uncontrollable fit of rage, Amahast charges down the beach and massacres the trio of Murgu with his spear. The 2 then go back to where the rest of the hunters are, and they find an area to temporarily reside in until the storm passes. But one of the hunters, whose name is Hastila, grows bored and decides to go out to at least stalk the deer, inviting Carrick so that he can learn how the process of sneaking is done. They find a spot next to a river to practice, but Hastila would make the fatal mistake of turning his back to it. A Murgu would crash through the surface of the water near where Hastila was standing and pull him down into the river, causing Carrick to run back to the rest of the hunters to tell them what had happened. When they are unable to find Hastila, they return to their camp to eagerly wait out the storm, now on edge that something dangerous was out there. Meanwhile, we're introduced to the Yilane, more specifically Valiente, who serves as the story's main antagonist. Valiente is on an uruketo, which is basically, in their language, an ichthyosaur, from Entoban heading towards Gendasi to overlook the developments of a new city that will be known as Alpeasak. Initially, a small group of Yilane, one of which was selected to be the Aista of the city, meaning she was going to be the city leader, were sent to complete this task, but due to some mishaps based on their disorganization and incompetence, Valiente, because of her admirable work ethic and leadership, had been selected to fix their mistakes, finish the task, and ultimately become the new Aista of this city. With her are a group of prisoners being brought to the new city to work as laborers. These prisoners are the Daughters of Life, for they value the lives of all living and conscious organisms. However, this belief goes against certain Yilane ideas and traditions, to the point where the religion is outlawed in their society, and anyone who's associated with it are oftentimes even considered to be lesser than Fargis. Along with this, many have given them the alternative name of Daughters of Death. This is important to know because one of the prisoners, whose name is Enge, is a part of Valiente's Enfenburu. In the Yilane language, Enfenburu basically refers to the clutch that they were born in together. In other words, they're sisters, who both have chosen very different paths in life. Enge decided to embrace this newfound belief of life, while Valiente worked hard to rise up the ranks, surpassing many others to get where she's at now. And as the new Aista of Alpeasak, Valiente has more to lose. While she herself doesn't understand or believe anything regarding the religion of the Daughters of Life, it's also a matter of her reputation. Kinda like our society, status for the Yilane is a very crucial part of their life. And doing certain things like associating with the wrong people could seriously damage her position. And because Valiente has more care for her role as the city's new leader, she doesn't care what happens to Enge. However, she still makes an offer for her. If Enge ditches her beliefs and the Daughters of Life group, Valiente will see to it that she has a job working alongside her and has important roles to fulfill. That way she doesn't have to be left doing the work of the Fargi. It's possible Valiente might have some level of care for her offensile, or sibling in their language, to give her an offer like this, of course, but it could also be because she's embarrassed by her sister for associating with such a group, and is trying to get Enge to work with her to make herself look better to others. But Enge refuses the offer, which angers Valiente. But before she can do anything, she's interrupted by another Yilane who tells her that they're close to the beaches of the new land. But when they look out towards the land, they see the massacre left behind by the Tanu. Valiente and the other crew members investigate the area, finding evidence of, to them, what seems to be some kind of otherworldly creatures. Ones that left behind five-toed footprints, charred wood which indicates the use of fire, and the strange gashes in the Fargi victims showing that they had killed them with strange and different weapons. Valiente is angered at the sight of yet another setback and punishes the guard that was supposed to be there to protect the defenseless Fargi, but was absent during the killing due to poorly thought out orders by the previous Aista. To put it simply, the initial Aista that was sent here before Valiente was not qualified and did little to no work on the actual city, and due to this poor mindset, everything was a mess. Valiente wishes to speak to the previous Aista, but learns that she had died days prior to her arrival. So without waiting any longer, Valiente and her group travel to the new city to get work started. When she does finally reach the city, she meets the higher authority figures of their respective fields that will now serve her. She updates them, and only them, of the events of the birth beaches, telling them about the kind of animals that were responsible for the killings. Even though they don't 100% know the kind of creatures that could have caused a massacre like this, it's agreed that something needs to be done about them, meaning they all need to be killed. Valiente meets the head huntress of the new city, whose name is Stalon. Stalon had ventured into the new and uncharted land of Gendasi and discovered it holds much different inhabitants than that of Entoban. While mammals, or Estuzu in the Yilane language, were relatively small over there, here they reach great sizes. And in Entoban, they've encountered species of Estuzu that's described similarly to that of a primate. With the evidence that they have of the ones that killed the Fargis at the birth beaches, Stalon concludes that she believes they're dealing with a different type of primate Estuzu, and that they could have only traveled north. With Valiente's permission, she sets out to go track them down. Meanwhile, Viente starts the development for Alpeasoc by having workers take down the old natural trees infested with wood-eating bugs, and plant new modified ones that will serve as their homes and place of businesses. She also oversees the planting of massive thorn bushes that serve as the protected barriers of the city and are modified to grow in that size in a matter of days. She also lets Enge and the rest of the Daughters of Life free into the city, warning Enge that she'll allow them to be free citizens so long as they keep their beliefs behind closed doors. Of course, Enge doesn't necessarily see this as a complete win, and throughout the story, things get more intense between these two because of this religious belief, but as of right now, there's not much she can do about it. Especially since because Stalon had returned from her travels of trying to track down the Estuzu and wishes to see Viente. When the two meet, Stalon tells Viente that they managed to kill one of the Estuzu and leads her to the body, where it's revealed to be none other than Hastila from earlier. Having never seen anything like it before, Viente is in complete shock and horror at the sight of it. They briefly study the creature and its accessories, amazed by how different and strange it is. And just so you get an idea of how the Yilane are reacting to this, they're looking at this human in the same way that we might look at them if the roles were reversed. They're surprised that this Estuzu is a male and poses any kind of threat to them because the males in their race are simple-minded and defenseless. They're surprised that this Estuzu's versions of Heizotsans are bows and arrows that need to be more manually handled in order for it to operate. They're surprised by how they decide to hide their private areas by wearing fur hides. And more than anything, they're completely surprised at the fact that the Estuzu have managed to reach this level of intelligence to be able to create and even use tools that, while primitive to the Yilane, are exceptional for wild animals. Along with being surprised by them, they're also extremely disgusted by them as well. And with that comes the natural hate towards the Estuzu, and they see them as vermin, of which there are surely more of. With that, Viente issues that at dawn they arm themselves and move towards the north to hunt down the rest of the Estuzu. The next day, Amahast and what's left of the small group of Tanu hunters finally arrive to their samad, which are in an encampment near the shores. But the welcome is short-lived as Amahast tells the rest of the samad that they need to start packing right away so that they can move out more north. Despite not giving a reason, the rest of the samad listens and packs everything up to start the last-minute travel. However, it would be too late. As they gathered their things, the Yilane would show up by the sea, riding the Uruketos, and start shooting at the Tanus with their Heizotsans. The ambush would prove to be overwhelming for the Tanu, as this was the first time most of them had ever seen creatures like this and the weapons they used. And for a lot of them, it would be their last as well, because the Tanu would end up losing this battle. Even Amahast, the Samadar, would be killed by the Yilane's fast weapons. The only survivors of this massacre would be Carrick and another child, a girl named Ysel. There was a third survivor, a defenseless Tanu baby that Viente, in a moment of rage and disgust upon being shown it, disposed of it quickly in a rather brutal fashion. But she decides to keep the other two for the sake of studying them if nothing else. The Yilane then return to Alpeasoc with their new prisoners, where Viente sends out for Enge. Despite Viente not liking her ideology, she still thought Enge was intelligent and actually needs her because of her ideology, mainly because she could use it to her advantage. Viente is curious of just how intelligent the Estuzu are, because despite how she views them as filthy and stupid animals, she has noticed that they manage to communicate verbally with each other in ways that she's never seen other animals do. And she understands that some animals can be domesticated and taught simple commands like the Uruketos, but she wants to teach the Estuzu more than just simple commands. She wants to see if they can manage to speak the Yilane language so that she can communicate and get more information from them about their race. She presents the hypothetical idea to Enge and orders her to at least try. I believe she chose Enge for this task because with her belief that all life is valuable, she'll surely have the patience, tolerance, and intelligence to be able to teach the Estuzu children the Yilane language. Viente shows Enge the two younger Estuzu they managed to capture who are locked away in a cell. When Enge examines them, she agrees to try to teach them how to speak the language, even if the task will be a difficult one. Days, weeks, possibly even months would go by with Enge showing up and attempting to teach their complex language to the two Tanu kids. Carrick, who was 9 at the time, was pretty hostile towards the Yilane at first. In fact, the first day, Carrick had to be bound by shackles because he had bitten Engay. If Engay was not there and it was instead Stalon that had gotten bit, she would have beaten Carrick into submission and then continue beating him until she saw fit. As days went by and the lessons continued, Carrick mainly ignored Engay's presence and seemingly ignored her teachings. Ysel, who was about 5 or 6 years older than Carrick, became more trusting of Engay, after she shows herself to not be an enemy to them. Engay doesn't want to hurt the kids and even acknowledges the Yilane's fault in massacring their families, though of course they can't understand her. And it's due to Engay's more friendly manner compared to the other Yilane that Ysel sits and listens to her teachings. Despite this amiability from Engay, it was not the same from the other Yilane. Ysel and Carrick's hairs were cut daily, Stalon was always rough with them, and they were never allowed to leave their cell. At first, they were fed what the story describes as enzyme-treated meats, which had a cold and gelatinous consistency to it. This is obviously pretty gross to the kids, so they didn't eat it at first. It isn't until Engay suggests that they may be omnivorous when they're finally given fresh fruit to eat. Much time would go by and Engay notices certain behavioral qualities between the two kids. Ysel tends to respond to kindness and has even attempted to communicate a few phrases as well, but oftentimes pretty badly. Carrick doesn't respond to anything, even if physical force is used on him. Because of this, Engay has concluded that he's just stupid, like the males in the Yilane race. While Engay continues her teachings, Vayente continues building the city. As time went on, Alpeasac grew bigger and stronger, proper defenses are put in place, the trees are grown, and the birth beaches have been moved more inland. Alpeasac was very much alive, much to Vayente's satisfaction, but she still stresses from the fact that soon the city will be visited by Malsis. Malsis is the Aista to a city in Entoban called Enigban. Her plans are to oversee Vayente's work as the Aista of Alpeasac and ensure everything is going smoothly, as one day she plans to combine this city with that of Enigban. Apparently climate conditions in Entoban have made it a harder place to live, so expanding to other areas to one day claim it as their new home would be inevitable, should they want to continue living, of course. Vayente, who worked hard to grow this city, doesn't like the idea that one day Malsis is going to come in and take over as the Aista once the official move happens. But she would worry about this later, as Malsis would eventually arrive. She's given the tour of the ever-growing and highly successful city, and she learns of Vayente's many successes and hard work towards making the city greater each day. They feast together to celebrate Alpeasac, and after, Malsis speaks with Vayente alone. She acknowledges all that Vayente has done for the new city, and is ready to head back to Entoban to report the good news to the other higher-ups. But before she does that, she tells Vayente that she's going to leave behind one of her Offensalae, whose name is Alakenzi to be more specific, to help aid her and basically be her assistant. And while this may seem like an act of generosity from Malsis, Vayente realizes that this was just a planned out power move, and Alakenzi was really there to help oversee things in Malsis' absence. This makes Vayente very angry because obviously she doesn't like the idea of being spied on or being babysat or being patronized. And so long as Alakenzi's presence was there, it was a constant reminder that she will one day be replaced by Malsis as the Aista. After Malsis finally leaves, Engay approaches her to ask her for more time with the Estuzu. But Vayente is not in the mood and demands to see how progress is going with their communication, as a lot of time has passed already. Her and Engay go back to the cell where Vayente tries to get Ysel to speak. Ysel attempts to, but her translation becomes very broken and incomprehensive to the Yilane. And because Vayente is already pissed off about something else, she completely loses her cool towards Ysel and picks her up, giving her one more chance to speak. Naturally, instead, Ysel screams in fear, causing Vayente to bite into her throat and kill the poor girl. After she kills Ysel, she goes after Carrick. But before she could get her hands on him, Carrick actually manages to speak. Not perfectly, but a much better and clearer attempt than Ysel's. Of course, Carrick is limited with certain parts of the language, as he doesn't have a tail to make certain gestures that the Yilane usually make with them, and he is unable to change the color of his palms. Despite this, Vayente could understand what he said. It was something along the lines of, "I very much don't want to die. I want very much to talk. Very long, very hard." With this, Vayente Viante allows Carrick to live, realizing that he could one day be of use to her. From that point on, the days were always the same for Carrick. In the beginning, Stalon would walk in, throw Carrick down to the ground to put his shackles on, and shortly after, Enge would walk in and continue teaching Carrick the Yilane language. At first, Carrick couldn't tell the difference between any of the Yilane that he would see, but as time passed, he would start to differentiate them from one another. He would continue to hate the Yilane, especially Stalon, who was always rough and clearly didn't like him. To be fair, nobody really likes him. That's just kind of their natural feeling towards him. But he noticed that Enge was different. She seemed to actually care about him to some extent, and is much more compassionate towards him than Stalon is. As the days went by, Carrick didn't give them any more issues, and his speech would actually improve, and soon he was communicating pretty well with Enge. One day, Carrick had even tried talking to Stalon, asking her why she always binds him and hurts him if he cannot hurt her, and keeping him shackled like that just makes it harder for him to speak. While Stalon doesn't care in the slightest, Enge agrees with Carrick and has Stalon take off his leg shackles for now. This is where Carrick learns that the more he behaves, the treatment will become less harsh. But this would be a very hard obstacle to cross, because despite his advances in Yilane's speech, Viante still sees him as a filthy animal. As a result, she wants to remove some Tanu qualities from him. So she changes Carrick's name to something more demeaning in the Yilane language. She has all of his hair continued to be shaved off, but this time with a new modified slug that the Yilane scientists created to feed on hair and clean Carrick's entire body of it. And she makes him wear a small breech clout to cover his private areas after she learns that it doesn't retract like male Yilanes. And what's disturbing about this breech clout is that it's actually made from the skin of Ysel. Yeah, I guess the Yilane just don't like wasting shit, so gotta reuse it for something, I suppose. Eventually, Viante becomes impressed enough with Carrick's speech that, for the first time while being imprisoned by the Yilane, he's allowed out of his cell when even more important Yilane from Entoban come to visit Alpeasoc. Viante hopes to impress these higher Yilane figures by showing off Carrick, an Astuzu that was taught how to speak as a Yilane. She does exactly that, and the whole time, Carrick behaved himself while being pulled with a leash around his neck, giving off a first good impression with the new Yilane. A lot of his good behavior came from the fact that he was too distracted by the Yilane's great city to even try to think about doing anything to give them a hard time. This was the first time in probably months out of his cell, so it was an adventure for him to be able to see Alpeasoc for the first time, especially since it's grown since he was first put in his cell. But again, he makes a good first impression, but when he's taken back to his cell by Stalon, he pretends that the collar is choking him. Stalon drops the leash to loosen it, and Carrick takes the opportunity to book it as fast as he can. Luckily for Carrick, he's able to outrun the Yilane by how slow they are on land, and he makes it all the way to the outskirts of the city. Unfortunately, right as Carrick attempts to pass one of the barriers that block off the city from the wild and uncharted land, he's grabbed onto by strong, sturdy vines which were artificially created by the Yilane to be used as a trap to give off a very tight grip, making it impossible for Carrick to free himself. But before Carrick is found and recaptured, he sees for a split second a bearded man in the brush. But the face quickly disappears, making Carrick wonder if it was in his head or if he really did see someone. Regardless, it didn't really matter because he was being dragged back into his cell by the Yilane that would eventually find him trapped in the vines. So let's focus on that bearded man real quick, because spoiler alert, this wasn't Carrick's mind playing tricks on him. This man is real, and his name is Haralock. Haralock was the brother of Amahast's wife, making him Carrick's uncle. He had heard word from another Samad that the valley floor near the ocean, which is where Amahast's encampment was empty. He took it upon himself to go check on the Samad, only to find the bones and remains of all of the Tanu that were killed in the initial attack from the Yilane. But he finds something else as well, the skeletal remains of one of the few Yilane that were killed during the ambush. It's a surprising discovery to him because not only does it look like a Marog, yet it's still different at the same time, but there's no way they could survive this far north. He puts two and two together that it was the Marogs that attacked and they came from the south, and it's likely they'll do it again. So with this in mind, he turns back north and starts his journey back home to rally up hunters from his Samad. He then leads them deeper into the south all the way to the outskirts of Alpeasoc. From here, Harlock goes in deeper alone to spy on the living city, where he makes several observations. He's able to see the Yilane in the flesh as a small group of them travel away from the city to the outskirts to complete various tasks. He also witnesses them using what he calls death sticks, which are their heizotsans, on nearby deer, and finally he briefly sees Carrick in his failed attempt at escaping Alpeasoc. Harlock goes back to the group of hunters and tells them what he saw. The following day, Harlock and his group wait by a river in the outskirts of the city where a group of Yilane on an urukedo show up. Harlock and the rest of the hunters wait for the perfect moment and then unleash a bunch of arrows at their targets, killing every one of them. One of the Yilane bodies falls into the water, to which Harlock retrieves so that he can show the rest of the Samad what they're going up against. And that's where Harlock's story ends for now. Going back to Carrick, upon learning about his attempted escape, Valiente is obviously not happy with it, and is shown a new method designed by one of the scientists from Entoban that will keep him from escaping ever again. This has come in the form of what the book describes as a semi-transparent jellyfish object that's put around Carrick's neck. The ends are rubbed with ointment of some kind and are pressed together to form a collar. By the way, like all of their creations, this thing that they're putting around Carrick's neck is a living animal. This animal then begins its secretion process that will make it grow strong and very hard to destroy. Not even a sharp blade can cut through the newly secured collar. But things get even worse for Carrick because they do the same process to a strong but dumb Fargi named Inlenu. They then attach Carrick's collar to Inlenu's with a lead made of the same living material. So from now on, wherever Carrick goes, he will be slowed down by the large and very slow Inlenu, making it impossible for him to escape again. So from this point on, just know that every time Carrick is mentioned, Inlenu is there with him as well. With the Estuzu secured, now Valiente has to deal with the group of field surveyors that had left to continue their work in the outskirts of the city that never returned. So the following morning, her, Stalon, Carrick, and a group of armed Fargi make their way down the river on urukedos to the spot they were last working on. When they arrive, they find no trace of the group except for their urukedo. This was the group that Harlock and the other Tanu hunters had killed earlier. And the Yilane eventually find out about this after they notice one of their arrows lodged into the thick hide of the urukedo that was accidentally left behind by the hunters. Immediately, Valiente suspects that more Estuzu were behind this, meaning that there were more out there that needed to be killed. So she heads back to Alpeasoc to get as much information about the Estuzu as she can out of Carrick. At this point, Valiente also has Carrick tell her about the concept of lying. She even gives him an offer. If he provides her with the information that she needs and helps her in executing certain plans, she'll see to it that he gets more privileges and better treatment. I mean, it's either that or she threatens information out of him and he gets nothing. So really, having no other choice, Carrick tells her what she wants to know. Valiente then tells Carrick that he's going to lie for her, to which he also agrees to. Many days later, Valiente, Stalon, Alakenzi, Carrick, and armed guards go out on urukedos again to check out their defenses around the city. On her cue, she has Carrick yell out that he sees Estuzu in the tree lines, which distracts everyone and gives Valiente the perfect opportunity to take the arrow that they had retrieved from the urukedo hide days prior and jab it into Alakenzi's chest when nobody's looking, which kills her almost instantly. When the rest of the group notices Alakenzi's dead body behind them, Valiente plays it off as if the arrow came from the trees, to which everyone believes. This would be a turning point for Carrick and his position in the Yilane society. This would not be the only time Valiente would have him lie for her, but she did keep her word. As time went by, Carrick would get more privileges. He would be by the Aista's side for a lot of the time, meaning he got to live a life of comfort as well. He was well fed, stayed inside the warm and heated trees, and considering he had even surpassed most Fargi in the knowledge of Yilane language, he was of higher rank than a lot of them and was allowed to order them around as well. But for simple things, of course. And as he grew conditioned to the life of the Yilane and of course being chained to Inlenu, he was even trusted to venture around the city alone without the worry of him escaping. Of course, even if he did have that idea in mind, the defenses around Alpeasoc have increased since the last Tanu attack, and would therefore make it much harder. Years would go by, and Carrick had passed the ranks to the point where he was no longer considered an Estuzu, but a Yilane. but that wouldn't be the only thing that would change as he got older. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put in a content warning for this next segment of the video because this next part of the book has a rather disturbing sequence that depicts rape. For those of you that are uncomfortable with that, I'll leave a timestamp on screen to where this specific sequence starts and where it ends so you can skip it entirely. So as I said, years go by, and while Carrick has no real perception of time, the book reveals that he would be around 15 years old when Valiente tells him that she plans to make a trip to Entoban to visit the city of Enigban, and tells Carrick that he's to go with her. Apparently, with the citizens of Enigban being so caught up with their own set of issues over there and the future of that city, they've completely ignored the Estuzu issues that await them in Gendasi, and Valiente wants to bring Carrick to remind them of that issue. Of course, with how much Carrick has adjusted to Alpeasak, he's now considered to be more of a Yilane than he is an Estuzu. So Valiente decides to give him back some of his Tanu accessories to make him appear more feral to them. This includes his dull blade that's laced around his neck and his fur hide. But again, he's been so conditioned to this new life that these things mean nothing to him anymore. So this is where things get very weird. As Afargi is changing Carrick out of his leather pouch and into the fur hide, Valiente notices that Carrick had developed since he was captured, and acknowledges that Estuzu male parts were very similar to Yilane male parts. Only the Yilane males are known to have two instead of one due to their reptilian nature. She grows this sense of disgust, but at the same time attraction towards Carrick. She then begins to touch him, making him feel completely uneasy and uncomfortable, and as he tries to pull away from her advances, she pins him to the ground and mounts him. The worst part about all of this is that even though Carrick has no idea what Valiente is doing to him, he would end up liking it. And that may sound very weird and disturbing because it is, but I'd argue that Harrison actually tackles this in a rather realistic way. Given Carrick's very unique circumstances of being kidnapped by a saurian race at an early age and adjusts to their lifestyle as he gets older, it would make sense that he wouldn't have any understanding on the concept of intercourse or anything of the like. So when he's put in this situation by Valiente, despite how uncomfortable it is to him, he also can't help but like the sensations of what is going on. In fact, it gets worse, because he secretly hopes it happens again. And it does, several times in fact. Don't worry, I won't go through those times as well, but it just goes to show the kind of things that Carrick goes through with the Yilane. I won't lie, after reading this particular chapter of the book, I did have to put it down for a while. It was a lot to process, okay? But we're past it, let's move on. Continuing the book, they make the trip to Enigban. When Carrick first learned that he was going on the trip with Valiente, he was both excited and afraid at the idea of what lies beyond this city that he's never seen before. They spend days out at sea on an urukedo until they eventually reach Entoban, where Carrick is split up from Valiente by Fargi, who take him to their science facility. There, he's examined by Yilane scientists who take great interest in the fact that there's an Estuzu that can actually talk. He's then taken back to the Ambassade, which is the central hub for the Yilane, where Valiente is talking to Malsis about the Estuzu problem. At first, Malsis doesn't really take the problem too seriously. That is until Valiente reminds her of the important and irreplaceable figures, including Alakenzi, that they've managed to kill so far. She even brings in Carrick and has him speak against his own kind, basically saying that just like the Yilane have a natural disgust and hatred towards them, they feel the same way towards the Yilane. This finally convinces Malsis and the other higher-ups, and they listen to Valiente's orders for what should be done to remedy this issue. Valiente suggests that they should have a way to spy on the constantly traveling Estuzu, but Malsis was way ahead of her. She has the scientists bring out a new creation, a feathered and flying raptor designed to withstand colder climates and travel far distances. But what makes this animal even more strange is the object wrapped around its ankle, which is said to be a neurological image recorder. In other words, this was a living living camera that could record images of whatever they wanted. The object is dark and elongated with an eye on one end that opens up and records the images. This is exactly what Viente is looking for, and so she's given the bird to take back to Alpeasoc, along with more armed Fargi to aid them in battle against the Estuzu. When they return to Alpeasoc, she puts Carrick in front of the bird so that it can get a good look at what to hunt for, and on command, the bird takes off towards the north. Days later, it returns and they begin the process of retrieving the images. When they do, they're able to see the Estuzu tribes and identify their location. And with that, Viente, Stalon, Carrick, and an army of Fargi set out to find them. They eventually find this group and slaughter most of them. Of the ones they didn't kill, they bound and forced to speak with Carrick so that he can translate what they said to the Yilane. The problem with this is that this was the first time in years that Carrick had seen or spoken to a Tanu, and he had grown so accustomed to speaking Yilane that whatever words the Tanu was saying meant almost nothing to him. But he does try and translate the little bit of the Marbach language that he still understands. Stalon forces Carrick to ask them a series of questions, mainly leading to finding out where the other Tanu are. When he's questioned by the prisoner why he would give up information to the Murgu, Carrick responds that he simply doesn't care. To him, he's just doing his job to survive. During this first hunt for the Estuzu, Carrick grows very ill and is taken back to be treated by the Yilane scientists, who keep him there for several days. When he regains consciousness, he takes the opportunity to try to learn more about the Yilane and really just a little more about the world itself, as it still remains very much a mystery to him, and if there's anyone or anything that would know more about it, it would be the Yilane scientists. Carrick would take some more days to fully heal, and eventually he's back out with Viente hunting more Estuzu. As they continue their trek, they stop in certain spots to hunt for food like deer with their Heizotsans. Carrick wishes to hunt with them, and while Stalon refuses, Viente has enough trust in Carrick to let him handle one of their weapons. Here he learns how to feed, load, and work the living gun to hunt down deer. And despite his unusual disadvantage of having to drag around a lumbering Fargi with him everywhere he goes, he did manage to have some successes with his hunts. Eventually, the Yilane are back at ambushing and killing the Estuzu that they've managed to locate. Carrick stayed behind since he was just there to translate more than anything. When the carnage was over, he would be brought onto the scene where he would witness the aftermath and all of the dead Tanu. At one point, he even goes into a brief crisis, wondering what he really is. Was he an Estuzu? If he was, he'd be a filthy, stupid animal as he was raised to believe by the Yilane. But was he truly a Yilane? He didn't look like one, but he was still treated like one. But does that necessarily make him not Tanu? He snaps out of it when Viente orders him to hold one of the Estuzu prisoner at gunpoint, while she and the rest look for more survivors that manage to get away. Carrick begins to question the single Tanu prisoner, who's revealed to be Haralock. Haralock is surprised to see a human amongst the Yilane, especially one that can speak their language and follow their orders. Haralock questions him and puts two and two together, that Carrick was captured, raised by the Yilane, and was a little boy that he saw trying to escape them all those years ago. He attempts to convince Carrick to escape with him now to the north, to return to the rest of his people. This means nothing to Carrick at first, but when Haralock notices the sky medal that Carrick has, he tells Carrick to reach into his pocket, where he finds an exact copy of the one that's laced around his neck, just twice as big. Haralock explains that it belonged to a great hunter, one by the name of Amahast. The name brought memories to Carrick, making him even more confused and frustrated to the point of becoming angry. But Haralock continues trying to get him to give in. And Carrick eventually does. He cuts Haralock loose with a spear, and just as he does this, Viente reappears surprised at the sight. She attempts to reach a nearby Heizotsan, and in a natural, almost uncontrollable reaction, Carrick throws the spear directly at her, striking her deep in her side and knocking her to the ground. Without looking back, Haralock, Carrick, and Yilane then run away deep into the tree line towards the north. As they make their escape, Carrick gets hit with the realization of what he had just done. He had murdered the Aista, the greatest crime any Yilane could ever commit. But there was nothing he could do about it now. All he can do is run. Eventually they stop and Haralock suggests killing Yilane so that Carrick can be free, but he refuses. On top of the fact that Yilane has been completely harmless to Carrick in the entire time they've been chained to each other, she was his last connection to Alpeasoc, something that he was not ready to let go of. He also tells Haralock that he can't cut himself free either due to the strength of the chain. Eventually, they take a break to hunt and eat, also running into another survivor from Haralock's Sama that was attacked earlier, a hunter named Ortnar. The following day, Carrick wakes up to find that Ortnar had murdered Yilane. To Ortnar, he had just killed another disgusting Marog, but to Carrick, he had killed an innocent creature. Carrick attacks Ortnar, almost killing him until Haralock intervenes, bringing a good point that Yilane would have died from the cold climate of the north anyways. Even Carrick couldn't argue with that logic. And to give him full control of his mobility for the first time in years, Haralock severs Yilane's head from the other end of the chain. While Ortnar is not sorry for killing the Marog, considering just the day before they had killed his entire Samad, he does admit that he might have been mistaken to do so, and since Carrick almost killed him, they're pretty much even, to which Carrick agrees with. With that out of the way, Haralock, Ortnar, and Carrick continue their journey, making stops to eat, with Carrick telling them that he knows about the Murgu's cultures and secrets, and Haralock and Ortnar teaching him how to be a Tanu again. At one point, Ortnar even tries to help Carrick get the indestructible collar and lead off of his neck by setting it ablaze, after they realize the Murgu don't use fire, meaning it could be a potential weakness to the material. This experiment would prove to be a success and they manage to burn most of it off, but to avoid burning Carrick's neck and face off, he jumps into the stream before it could reach his collar. He decides against trying the experiment again for a while at least, and to just leave the collar as is. Knowing they can't go on with their lack of resources, Haralock decides to go back to the shores, much to Carrick's dismay. While he's sure the Yilane wouldn't stay there for long since they only packed enough supplies to make the attack against a Tanu, he still didn't like the idea of going back to where they could be waiting for him. Regardless, they head back to the overran encampment to gather what they need and plan to go west to find more hunters. As they do this, Carrick tries to rationalize the idea of going back to Alpeasoc, the city that he's grown so accustomed to living in that he wonders if there's a chance he could go back. No one saw him wield the spear that killed Valiente, and Haralock and Ortnar could go west without him. But Haralock snaps him out of his trance and gives him Amahast's sky metal knife, which had been laced into a necklace. He tells Carrick to put it next to a smaller one that he had when he was a boy, to remind himself of who he is and where he came from, and what the Murgu took away from him. It was then that Carrick realized there was no going back to Alpeasoc. This was his life now. The three head west until they meet the Samad of Ulfodon, who had combined forces with another Samad as both are facing the same issues of facing a harsh winter and having little food. They gathered the Samads to tell them what they had gone through and that Carrick had actually lived amongst the Murgu for several years and knows much about the way they live and plan and behave, giving the Tanu the advantage they need. Based on the information Carrick provides, the best plan of attack is to ambush the Murgu at night, as by the time it gets dark, they become too torpid to travel. He also warns the Samads of the large bird that spies on them in the sky and will report back to the Murgu. With that, they come up with a plan. Since the winters were too harsh and food sources were scarce, they would have no choice but to go south to find good hunting grounds to gain enough food for the winter. As they're doing this, they plan to have some of their hunters stationed along the beaches to keep watch for Murgu to warn of an attack. So even if they were spotted by the large bird, they would be ready. Should they see the Murgu come ashore, they'll wait till night falls and attack them when they least expect it. And the plan goes as followed. Much to the Samad's dismay, as they are understandably scared of the idea of confronting the Murgu, they inevitably get spotted by the bird, and days later, the Murgu sail to the shores where they set up their temporary base, and the Tanu wait until night to sneak into their encampment armed with their spears to kill them in their sleep. Of course, this doesn't go exactly as planned, but the Tanu would be victorious in this attack. as the ambush caught the Mergu completely off guard, leading to most of them being killed and few survivors retreating to the boats. The Tanu then gather all of the left behind Mergu supplies, including some of their Heizotsans and darts, which Carrick teaches the other Tanus how to use for future battles. Going back to the Yilane for a bit, the story focuses on Stalon, one of the few survivors of the most recent attack, who heads back to Alpeasac to report on what happened. Here, it's revealed that Valiente had unsurprisingly survived Carrick's failed murder attempt, but was weak and still healing. Upon learning the news, she and the other Yilane make plans to upgrade their army and materials because more than ever before, she wants the Tanu dead, especially Carrick. Going back to the hunters, Carrick tries to put his 2 cents into the constant winter issues the Tanu have. Of course, with how different he looks to the others, no one takes him very seriously. That is until Haralock, a respected hunter to the rest of the Samad, stands up for him. Haralock really is the unsung hero of this story. Many points in this book, there are people who are very doubtful of what Carrick has to say, because what he says are truths that they don't want to hear. Not to mention, he acts and appears different than a normal Tanu given his very unique situation, so people are inclined to ignore him, everyone except Haralock, who is not only open to hear what Carrick has to say, but gets everyone else to open up to his ideas as well. Had it not been for Haralock's trust towards Carrick and forcing these people to listen to the one person that does know how the Mergu live, they would all be dead. In fact, it would be Haralock that would establish a new title especially for Carrick, which is called Margalus, or the Mergu Counselor, meaning that he's the one to consult when it comes to anything relating to the Mergu since he's the most knowledgeable with them. Anyways, with the Tanu's current issue, the winters are harsher and last longer and causes deer to travel south to warmer climates. To the east, the land is barren until they reach the shores, where it's nothing but endless oceans. To the west are more but territorial Tanu. So Carrick suggests that they just go south for the winter, where the weather is warm and food is plentiful. Of course, this isn't taken lightly, as the Tanu have associated going south with just certain death, as the land down there is teeming with Mergu. But with the newfound and powerful weapons the Tanu hunters collected from their first successful attack against the Mergu, Carrick is confident that they'll have a stronger chance of survival. Eventually, the hunters agree to do this despite the risk, and they prepare for their trip south. Carrick takes this time to fill them in on more information about the Mergu and trains them to use the Heizotsans. During all of this, they also managed to kill the bird that had been spying on them and revealing their location to the Yilane. This gave them the ultimate advantage to travel south safely. As they make their way into the unknown, they encounter all kinds of different dinosaurs, some carnivorous and dangerous that they have to kill off using their Heizotsans, but others more peaceful and easy to hunt and use for food. They eventually make their winter encampment on a plain near a steep trail that leads to a river, where certain precautions are taken to avoid any unsuspecting attacks from the Mergu. Despite being on edge at first, considering this world is very new and dangerous to this group of Tanu, the rest of the Samad eventually come to enjoy their time here. The hadrosaurs made for good eating, they didn't have to worry about excessively cold temperatures, and the mammoths, which they've been using to pull travois full of their supplies, have plenty of grass to graze on. And the most surprising thing about all of this was, for a while, they weren't bothered by the Yilane. An attack never came, and so the Tanu became comfortable with their new lifestyle. Perhaps a bit too comfortable. During a hunt in the nearby jungles, Carrick and the other hunters are ambushed by a tree Mergu of some kind. It successfully kills one of the hunters and breaks Carrick's leg in the process. They take him back to camp, treat his injuries, and leave him in a tent until he heals. One night while the rest of the tribe honors the hunter that was killed, Carrick is being taken care of by Armun, a Tanu female that was born with a hair lip and is mostly outcasted by the rest of her Samad because of it. She lost her parents at an early age, and those that took care of her only did so out of pity, leaving her to be an easy target for the children to make fun of her for her deformity. But not Carrick, who was able to look past it to see someone who understood his dilemma of feeling out of place and alone. And for the first time in his life, Carrick would finally be physically intimate with a Tanu female, an experience that would prove to be much warmer and welcoming in comparison to the cold and forceful nature that Valiente had. And speaking of Viente, she's all better now, and the reason why they've been so dormant is because the merging of Enigbon with Alpeasoc had finally happened. Malsis had taken over as Ayista of the two cities that are now one, but appreciates Viente's work enough to keep her on board with the rest of the higher-ups to continue fighting against not just the Estuzu, but the Daughters of Life as well. But focusing on the Estuzu, the Yilane haven't forgotten about the spy bird that they killed. In fact, they would make several more, and different kinds as well, all having the same black neurological eye wrapped around their leg to record images of the unsuspecting Estuzu. The Tanu would eventually find out about all of these new birds after one of them accidentally kills an owl that's revealed to have one of those neurological eyes. They no longer felt safe there and decide that it may be best to head back north despite the fact that it's not spring yet, meaning the weather will be harsh and food sources will be scarce. They have to rely on what they can take with them, which should be enough to last them until spring. And as they're readying themselves for their journey back, a pair of fast-moving hunters are sent 2 days more down south to check the river of any signs of oncoming attacks. When they head out, they find an attack is coming, but not from the water. A massive herd of dinosaurs consisting of hadrosaurs and segnosaurs charge their way towards where the encampment is. And the two hunters see that armed Yilane are saddled onto the dinosaurs. The herd catches up to them and manages to kill one of the hunters while the other one gets away. The Yilane controlling the herd decide to return to Alpeasoc to report back to Viente, and while they're doing that, the surviving hunter does the same with the Tanu. They decide it's best to march back towards the north as the Yilane won't be able to survive the cold weather if they travel far enough. Out of fear of encountering the Murgu, the Tanu go for as long as they possibly can. But when they reach a steep hill, they realize that they can't keep going on like this. But the Murgu are not far behind them, so the Tanu hunters take advantage of the steep hill and prepare themselves for a battle. They conceal themselves and lie in wait for the Yilane to show up, which they eventually do on the backs of segnosaurs and genetically modified psittacosaurs made to be very large and 8-legged for long-distance travels. The Tanu then strike with spears, arrows, and Heizotsans. Overwhelmed with the attack, the Yilane retreat and regroup down the hill, giving another victory to the Tanu. Of course, the Yilane don't give up that easily, and are still following the Tanu, who spend the following days traveling north and planning out their next strategies to prepare themselves for any more attacks and or get themselves north faster. Finally, they would make it far enough to see the snowfall, and as they continued up the mountain, the Yilane retreated back down south. While out of danger for now, the Tanu weren't satisfied with this. They're tired of constantly changing courses and living in fear because of the Murgu. And at the same time, they didn't want to continue suffering through the terrible winters that were only getting longer as the years go by. So they eventually begin discussing their very minimal options. The north would continue to freeze, the east will only end in ocean, the south is full of Murgu. Carrick suggests they head towards the west, where the land is said to be arid and dry, eventually leading to a seemingly never-ending desert that will provide little food and water. But since not even the Murgu have traveled this far out, it could be worth a shot. Especially since the area was blocked off by large mountains and foothills that would be difficult to get across from. However, the Tanu made this journey as difficult as it was and made it to the desert. They traveled in it for about 4 days before water supply began to dwindle, so they turned around to head back to the foothills. On their way back, some of the hunters encounter and kill a Tanu from a different Samad, but this one looked very different. This one had darker skin and hair and belonged to the Harwan group, who were known to be hostile towards other Tanu. But they weren't the only ones out here. Other dark-skinned Tanu make their appearance clear, but instead of attacking Carrick's group, they simply watch them in curiosity. So to avoid more killing, Carrick attempts to communicate with this group, who will eventually be known as the Sasuke people. Carrick sits down and waits for them to approach him, which one does as others await behind the nearby brush. The two cannot understand each other as they speak completely different languages, but the peaceful intent is made clear, especially when the Sasuke individual gives him a dark bowl of water for him to drink. After he drinks the water, he notices the bowl is decorated with a familiar looking design, one in the shape of a mastodon. At first, he doesn't know what this means, but eventually he understands that in Sasuke culture, mastodons held great significance and are worshipped. Carrick heads back to his samad to report on his progress with befriending the new Tanus, and returns the next day with peace offerings of his own. Soon, he grows comfortable around the Sasuke hunter and his tribe members, and they feel the same towards him, enough to show him where they live, which ends up being a whole city not far from where Carrick and his samads were. This sight of a Tanu city completely surprised Carrick because he's never seen one before. The only cities he ever saw were ran by the Yilane, and their way of life was much different than the Sasuke. For starters, the Sasuke were more peaceful and welcoming, and lived what the book described as a Neolithic farming lifestyle. Carrick meets some of the locals, including a light-skinned Tanu that spoke Marbok and was able to help with proper translations. Carrick eventually learned the Sasuke had their own set of beliefs that involved the mastodons. In their religion, their creator and deity was named Carrick, who took the form of a mastodon so that it could stamp its heavy feet to create valleys, use its trunk to provide water, and use its dung to make the world fertile. When his job was complete, Carrick left behind the mastodon to remind Earth's inhabitants of what he created for them. And it's because the Sasuke worshipped and loved these mastodons so much that they decided to help Carrick and his group. The rest of the Samads are introduced to the Sasuke, and the two groups live peacefully in the same area. Apart enough so that the Samads can continue their own way of life, but close enough so that the Sasuke can come and see their mastodons whenever they get the chance. Carrick and Armoon especially embrace the Sasuke's culture and lifestyle, befriending the people and learning their language. For the first time in her life, Armoon felt welcomed and held no shame for her hair lip. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this earlier, but before they even started their trip towards the west, Armoon had told Carrick that she was pregnant and that she would have the baby sometime in the spring. And everything works out perfectly, as Armoon is able to have her baby within the safety of the Sasuke city, who she ends up naming Arnwheat. Life is good. That is, until they're paid an unexpected visit from someone belonging to the Kargu people, another group of Tanu that resided on a different region of the foothills. The Kargu man Samad had been mysteriously killed, and he reveals the only piece of evidence that he found at the scene, which was the poisonous dart the Yilane used for their Hazod-sans. The Yilane had finally made their way west. Carrick had talked to the Sasuke people about the Murgu before, who have weapons powerful enough to take down even the mastodons, a sight that pains the Sasuke to even think about. But now that both of their ways of life are being threatened by a common enemy, the Sasuke team up with the Samads to prepare for a battle against them. The Yilane eventually strike, but the Tanu stand their ground in the valley, and although the attack is strong, they're able to hold their positions until night falls, forcing the Yilane to retreat. But they station themselves in an area nearby guarded by biological creations to make it hard for any of the Tanu to sneak in for an ambush. However, from afar, the Tanu are able to shoot arrows at the dormant Yilane, decreasing their numbers throughout the night. The following day, they were ready for an attack, but the valley stayed silent. Eventually, Haralock went to go check the field the Yilane were stationed at, seeing that it was completely empty. They won another battle, but it was all the same. They win one battle and the Yilane retreat, but then come back with more numbers and weapons, causing the Tanu to have to come up with new strategies and ways to fight against the oncoming attack. It was time for a different, more effective strategy, and Carrick knows exactly what to do. He comes to the realization that despite how intelligent the Yilane are, there was something that they weren't very knowledgeable in, which was fire. They know the basics. It's hot and it can hurt you if you touch it, but they don't know how powerful and destructive it can be if it's out of control because they don't use it. Heat and light are sourced from their biological creations, and they prepare their meat differently than the Tanu do, showing that they don't have a need for fire. And considering Alpeasak is literally made of trees and vegetation, the Tanu should have no problem lighting it all ablaze. So they devise their plan and make the journey southwest to take the battle to the Yilane. Meanwhile, Vayente had made her way back to Alpeasak, because she was one of the people who were leading the charge against the Tanu. But due to her failures fighting against the Estuzu, she's fallen out of favor from Malsus and the other higher-ups. She's temporarily revoked of her status until the higher-ups decide what to do about her. But considering how rampant the Estuzu issue still is, and Valiente already proving herself to be a strong leader, Malsus decides she is still needed and gives her another chance. Her, Valiente, and Stalon begin planning for their next step, trying to set traps and attacks towards the Estuzu, all of which don't work. They make their way closer and closer to the city until they're at the outskirts, unknowing to the Yilane. They do their best to sneak further into the city to make their attack, but are eventually spotted. With no more time left, they run deeper into the fringes of Alpeasoc until they make it to the outer part of the main city, where they ignite a small flame to the undergrowth by one of the trees. Soon, the flames grow large and uncontrollable and begin devouring the living city and its inhabitants. Not only was the attack unexpected to the Yilane, but so was the strategy. And because they have no idea how to fight against fire, the Yilane would react with mass chaos and confusion. And to give you an idea of just how much they lack the knowledge of fire, some of the Fargi and even Yilane try to use the Ambased, which is just another tree, for cover and to seek guidance from Malsus. The flames would inevitably reach the Ambased and kill everything inside, including the Aista. Some of the Fargi didn't even attempt to make a run for it at first. The fire provided a nice source of heat and felt nice to them, but they didn't start to panic until they were literally caught in it. The attack would be successful for the Tanu, but Carrick has a sense of disgust towards the death of Alpeasoc. In truth, he actually loved this city and its many wonders and mysteries. It was the citizens a part of that city that he despised and was happy to see them burn alive. But he was sad to see the beautiful city go. However, while Alpeasoc was gone, there were still survivors making their way to the beaches to escape back to Entoban on Uruketos. Among the survivors are Valiente, Stalon, and Enge. Enge argues with Valiente, telling her that her hatred for the Estuzu is what killed their once great city. At this point, Valiente has had it. She completely disowns Enge, telling her that she and the rest of the surviving Daughters of Death can stay and die with the city, and then orders Stalon to kill her. But as she lifts her Hazotsan to shoot Enge, she stops after she notices a familiar Estuzu. It was Carrick. If there was one Yilane that Carrick hated more than Valiente, it was Stalon. And the entire time that he has been at war with them, he's made it very clear that he wants to be the one to kill her. Ignoring everyone and everything else, Carrick charges down the beach with his spear towards Stalon, who dodges his attack. She grabs Carrick, disarms him, and sharing the same hatred towards him as he does her, she begins to do what she's wanted to do since she first saw him. Right as she's about to tear the life out of him with her jaws, Haralock throws his spear into her mouth and through her brain, killing her instantly. At this point, Valiente had already swam to the nearby Uruketo, leaving behind Enge, who Haralock goes after next before being stopped by Carrick. Saddened at the events that have taken place, Enge tells Carrick that he had brought death to the Yilane, to which Carrick disagrees and says that he instead brought life to the Tanu. Carrick then tells her that Gendasi is now for the Tanu and Entoban is for the Yilane, and given their inability to live peacefully together on the same landmass, it should stay that way. Any Yilane that steps foot in Gendasi will be killed. Enge then reminds him that while there is a battle between Estuzu and Yilane, there is no battle between her and him, to which Carrick agrees. Enge was his teacher, the most peaceful and friendly of the Yilane, and the only one that he has no desire to kill. He lets her leave peacefully to the Uruketos, telling her to relay the message that he told her to the rest of the Yilane race. The story ends with this victory for the Tanu, and Carrick telling Haralock that it was time for them to go back home. I loved this book. Learning everything that I have about the setting and its inhabitants have been an extremely fun experience, even with the story as grim as it was. I loved the extensive amount of lore and history the Yilane and the Tanu have outside of what's written within the base story of the book. It provides for amazing world building and the idea that this world is so new and unpredictable. I appreciate Harrison for putting in the work to make what I personally think is a timeless story. If I had one complaint to make about the book, it's that it does have some slow parts to it that were a bit of a slog to get through. And don't get me wrong, I think it's important for a book to establish the proper amount of information to get across to the audience, but there were minor points here and there where I felt that it was going on for longer than it needed to. And keep in mind, I'm only basing my thoughts on book 1. I'm yet to read the other 2 sequels as I'm making this video, so keep in mind that this isn't my opinion on the series as a whole. But don't worry, I'll get to those eventually. I know, for me, that can mean any time within this next decade. All jokes aside, I'll try to get to the other 2 videos at some point this year, but it's hard because projects like these end up being very long. Much longer than I initially anticipated. I mean, when I started this one, I thought it was going to be no more than an hour long. How naive I was. Thank you all for joining me on this journey through West of Eden. This has me very excited for the next book in the series, and I can't wait to start work on that video somewhere down the line. Thank you Wondrium once again for sponsoring this video. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and please, have a nice day.